Jerome glanced at his watch and then back at the stack of boxes inside his apartment. It was early morning, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional bark of a distant dog or the hum of a waking city. Today was a big day for him. He was moving. As he carefully moved the box labeled books onto the hand truck, his thoughts fluttered with anticipation about his new neighborhood and the fresh start awaiting him. Jerome's reverie was interrupted by a feeling of being watched. He looked up, catching the eye of his neighbor, Kate, who was peering through her slightly parted curtains. Kate was an older woman with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Jerome had seen her many times, always from a distance, as their interactions were limited to curt nods. Kate had a reputation for being particularly intrusive, often inserting herself into matters that didn't concern her. Her demeanor towards Jerome had always been cold. He could feel her suspicion. He had heard stories from other neighbors about how she would keep meticulous notes on everyone's comings and goings, and often made calls to the Homeowners Association over trivial matters. Jerome tried to dismiss the discomfort Kate's scrutiny caused him, focusing instead on his packing. He lifted a heavy box filled with his photography equipment, a hobby that had provided him much solace and a creative outlet during his time here. As Jerome secured another box in the back of the rental truck, he sensed Kate's presence even before he turned to see her approaching. Her gait was deliberate, her expression tight with a familiar look of disapproval that seemed permanently etched onto her features. Jerome braced himself, setting down the box and wiping his hands on his jeans as he turned to face her. "Morning, Kate," Jerome greeted, trying to keep his tone light despite the tension he felt. "Jerome," Kate nodded stiffly, her eyes flicking past him to the open apartment door. "Quite a bit of activity this morning. Moving out, are we?" "Yes, I got a new job across town." "Better opportunity for me," Jerome replied, hoping the explanation would satisfy her curiosity. Kate hummed noncommittally, her eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the labeled boxes and furniture waiting to be loaded. "All this yours then?" she asked, her voice carrying an undercurrent of accusation that made Jerome's spine stiffen. "Everything here is mine, yes. Been gathering it for years," Jerome responded, maintaining a calm demeanor. He could feel the accusation hanging in the air, unsaved but clear. Kate's skepticism was not unexpected, but it was unwelcome on a day that should have been filled with nothing but positive anticipation. "And you have documentation for all this?" Kate pressed, her tone implying doubts about his integrity. Jerome sighed inwardly but reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded paper, the rental agreement for the truck and his moving checklist, where he had meticulously itemized his possessions to ensure a smooth transition. He handed it to Kate, who took it with a skeptical raise of her eyebrow. "Here's everything listed in my rental agreement. I like to keep things organized," Jerome explained, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling inside him. Kate scanned the document with a scrutinizing gaze, her lips pursed. After a moment, she handed the papers back to Jerome with a reluctant nod, though her eyes still held a shadow of doubt. "Well, I'll be keeping an eye out. You can't be too careful these days," she said, her voice suggesting that the matter might not be settled in her mind. "And I appreciate your vigilance for the neighborhood," Jerome replied diplomatically, though he wished he could express his true feelings about her intrusive behavior. Kate lingered a moment longer, her gaze piercing, then turned and walked back to her house without another word. Jerome watched her retreating back, feeling a mix of relief and irritation. He folded the documents and tucked them back into his pocket, his hand shaking slightly with a cocktail of anger and anxiety. Despite the unsettling encounter, Jerome turned back to his task, determined not to let Kate's baseless suspicions tarnish his day. He lifted another box, mentally preparing himself for the possibility of further confrontations. As the morning progressed and Jerome's belongings steadily filled the rental truck, the unexpected sound of sirens was heard in the neighborhood. A police car turned into the driveway. Jerome, recognizing the potential source of this disturbance, sighed deeply, a mixture of resignation and disbelief coloring his features. Kate, who had made the call, stood a careful distance away, her arms crossed as she watched the unfolding events with a stern expression. She nodded briefly to the officers as they approached, her demeanor suggesting that she believed her actions were justified. Jerome's friends, who had been jovially helping him pack, now stood in uncertain silence, exchanging uneasy glances. Jerome stepped forward, his approach calm and measured, to meet the officers as they exited their vehicles. "Good morning, officers," Jerome greeted them, his voice steady despite the churn of frustration inside him. "I understand there's some concern about what's happening here. I'm just moving out, and all of these items are mine. I can show you my lease agreement and the moving truck rental documentation." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a skeptical but open demeanor, nodded. "We received a call about a possible burglary. It's our duty to check on these reports. Could you provide some proof that you're just moving out?" Jerome nodded, returning to the truck to retrieve his paperwork. The documents were thorough, listing his belongings alongside his lease termination notice and the rental agreement for the truck. He handed these over to the officers, who examined them alongside another officer speaking briefly with Kate. After a few moments, the officers confirmed the legitimacy of Jerome's move. The senior officer turned to Kate, explaining politely but firmly that everything was in order and that such calls should only be made on solid grounds to avoid wasting police resources and causing unnecessary distress. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," the officer told Jerome, handing back his documents. "Everything seems to be in order here. You're free to continue with your move." Relief washed over Jerome, though it was tinged with the bitter aftertaste of the unnecessary scrutiny. He thanked the officers, who gave him an understanding nod before preparing to leave the scene. Turning to his friends, Jerome managed a wry smile. "Let's just finish up and get out of here," he said, the desire to leave this part of his life behind growing even stronger. As they resumed loading the truck, the solidarity among Jerome and his friends deepened, their efforts quickening with the shared urgency to move on from this unpleasant episode. The incident with Kate and the police had underscored the reasons for his departure, reinforcing his resolve to find a more accepting and peaceful community in his new neighborhood. With the last box securely packed and the apartment door locked behind him, Jerome took one final look around. It was time to close this chapter and drive towards a new beginning, hopeful that his future community would offer a warmer welcome. As the officers concluded verifying Jerome's documents and his legitimate reasons for moving, their attention shifted back towards Kate. She stood somewhat defiantly, though the firmness in her posture wavered as the scene drew more neighbors out of their homes, curious and concerned about the disruption. The senior officer, whose demeanor reflected a blend of professionalism and mild frustration, approached Kate. With the gathered crowd now murmuring and watching, he spoke in a tone that carried both respect and authority. "Ma'am, I understand you were concerned, but it's very important to make sure that such calls are based on more than just suspicion. Misuse of emergency services takes resources away from real emergencies and causes unnecessary distress for all involved." Kate's face registered the impact of the officer's words. She glanced around at the onlookers, many of whom shook their heads slightly or looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. It was then that Mr. Thompson, a long-respected elder in the neighborhood, stepped forward. Known for his wise and fair-minded nature, Mr. Thompson had always been a unifying figure in the community. As he spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. "Kate, I've known Jerome since he moved here. He's been nothing but respectful and kind. He's kept to himself and even helped out during the community drive last winter. We should be helping him on his moving day, not making it harder." Kate appeared taken aback as Mr. Thompson continued. "We all need to live together with understanding and trust. Calling the police without any real evidence disrupts not just Jerome's day, but all of ours." The crowd nodded in agreement, and a few murmured their support of Jerome, who stood silently, grateful for Mr. Thompson's intervention but eager to leave this all behind. The police officer nodded appreciatively towards Mr. Thompson, acknowledging his words. Turning back to Kate, he added, "It's crucial to consider the impact of your actions on your neighbors and the community. We hope this situation serves as a reminder of that responsibility." Kate, now visibly shaken and realizing the gravity of her actions, muttered an apology to the officer and the crowd, though she couldn't bring herself to meet Jerome's gaze directly. As she retreated back into her house, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Jerome, feeling a mix of vindication and wariness, thanked Mr. Thompson and the officers. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for speaking up. And thank you, officers, for handling this situation." With the ordeal finally over, the officers departed, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Jerome's friends rallied around him, patting him on the back and offering words of encouragement. The mood lightened, and the pace of work picked up as everyone came together to help Jerome finish his move. As Jerome closed the truck's back door, he looked around at the supportive faces of his friends and the few neighbors who had chosen to help rather than hinder. He knew he would carry these friendships with him, a comforting thought as he prepared to start anew, away from the misunderstandings and toward a community where trust and support were the foundations of neighborly relations.